Hello everybody, Darren Cross here. Welcome to MBA 652. We are in Module 2 of Organizational Behavior, and this is the intro or lecture video for Module 2. In this module, we're going to be going over chapters 3 and 4. So we're talking about perceiving ourselves and others in organizations and the role that stress in the workplace plays. And I'm giving you the overview here and laying the foundation, but you'll find all of the necessary materials inside of the chapters in the PowerPoint. So the basic essence of all of this stuff is trying to figure out what's making people behave in a certain way. And remember, the Mars model puts forth 4 elements that actually influence how people behave, right? And so those are motivation, ability, role perceptions. Those are all internal to the employee. And then there's situational factors. Now, you remember we've already talked about personality and attitude, and those things come into play to inform inside of the person. And so we're going to talk about a couple more things, and probably the biggest determinant of how people behave. So everything is based upon the concept of perception, right? And perception is basically how we actually make sense of everything that's around us. So we're sensing all of these things through the senses that we have. Then we put it through our filter, and we use that in order to derive some kind of meaning out of it. And on the basis of that, that influences motivation, ability, role perception. It influences our perception of those things, and in turn, it influences our behavior as well. And so all of our perception is based on our self-concept. And so when we're talking about self-concept, it's basically who we think we are, how we define ourselves, or what we think actually goes along with us. And our self-concept is basically everything, because we cannot operate outside of our self-concept, right? And so our self-concept really is not necessarily simple. In fact, the book talked about the 4 C's of self-concept: complexity, consistency, clarity, and the 3 C's, I'm sorry, clarity. And the deal is, our self-concept is actually a combination of those things. So to the extent that we have complex self-concepts, right? So it's not just I am this. We find ourselves doing different things in different situations. And so we have the work us, and then we have the home us, and then we have the recreational us, right? And so our self-concept is complex, and we're healthier when we have a complex self-concept. You can't just be one person and express only in one way the whole time, right? Then you have consistency. There are some things that actually are consistent across different situations and across time. And finally, there's clarity. Basically, to the extent that we have clarity about who we are, we have a healthy basis upon which we can behave. Now, the 4 things that I was talking about are the 4 selves, and we will talk about these because they're pretty important. The 4 selves: self-enhancement, self-verification, self-evaluation, and our social self. Right? So when we're talking about self-enhancement, we have this internal need to kind of make ourselves look good in situations. And so one of the things that happens is, when we are perceiving things, we perceive them from the idea that we that puts us in the best possible light. And it's just natural. We, even when we are, even when we're trying to be humble, it's really hard not to do that. And so here's an example. So, if you go and tell a story that happened, I've seen this, and I've done this myself. So you say, so I was at the grocery store today, and this lady cut in line, and I say, excuse me, you can't cut in line in front of me, and really I said nothing. It was just something that I wish I had said, right? But the way I'm explaining it, I'm a lot braver than I was when this situation was actually happening. It's because I want people to think, hey, I take care of business. I don't let people push me around and that kind of thing. I want to enhance the image that people view about me, and I want to feel good about myself at the same time. So we kind of do that, and we kind of have that perception whenever we're doing things. So just keep that in mind, because as we go along, it's going to come into play. We also have this concept of self-verification. The biases and feelings and thoughts that we have, we actually tend to notice those things that are in agreement with that. So we are looking for things that say, see, I told you so. I mean, just look at this last election when we have people who something happens and they ignore all of the things that actually disagree with their points of view, but then they say, but then they point in and say, see, this is the reason why, because they're honing in on only those things that agree with them. And we tend to do that. We tend to pay attention when something actually verifies our self-concept in some way, and we tend to not pay attention whenever it doesn't. There's also the concept of self-evaluation. And when we're talking about self-evaluation, it's really just looking at ourselves and determining three things. First of all, our self-esteem. So how do we feel about ourselves? Are we satisfied with who we really are? And that informs how we think, how we feel, and how we behave. We're also looking at self-efficacy. How likely, or that's about, do we feel like we can do things, right? So how able do we feel in situations? Do I feel like I can do certain things? And we evaluate that as well all the time. And then finally, there is a locus of control. So we're talking about how much control we feel like we have. And these are things that are all kind of mixing together. And I know there's a lot of concepts here, and I want you to go through and look at them, but I want to mention them because they're super important. And then our social self. It's important to note that the way that we identify ourselves has to do with different groups that we want to associate with, and we behave and think differently as a result of being associated with those actual with those organizations, right? And so it's important to know that. One last thing that I want to talk about with regard to perception is a very important concept. It's probably my favorite concept in organizational behavior because it's so interesting. And this is the basis upon which we can start to evaluate behavior, right? And it's the attribution theory, basically. And the attribution theory says that it's how we actually decide whether or not this is you or if it's an external factor, right? So you're trying to determine, is this basically something that I can change with the behavior? Is this the person? So does this actually go into the motivation, the ability, or the role perception part, or is this a situational factor? And so in order to do that, what we need to do is take into consideration three things. First of all, consistency. How consistent is this behavior? Does this person do this all the time, or is it something that seems like an out of character kind of thing? And we do that. Don't you do that when you see something that happens and it's kind of a rare behavior for someone? You say, that is really kind of weird. I don't think that is really strange for that person. Something weird must be going on. So there must be some kind of external situation that's influencing that. What about distinctiveness? Is this something that happens in different situations, right? So, if a person is late to school, are they also late to work and late to other things, right? So it's not necessarily how often do they do this, it's do they do it in different situations. And if it turns out that a person does it in different situations, then you might say, hey, this is a behavior that they do all the time, so it's probably an internal thing. But if this is the only situation where this behavior is happening, then perhaps there's something inherent about this situation that's influencing that behavior as well. And then finally, consensus. Is this, and we do this as well, like if you're a teacher and someone bombs a test, you would say, how did everybody else do in the class? Or if someone turned in something late, one of the things that you might say is everybody else in the class turned their assignment in on time. So that tells me that there must be something with you, right? So there's something about your situation that this is internal to you and that kind of thing. So this is how we can kind of determine what's going on. But we have to be careful when we're talking about this because of the attribution errors, right? So there's the self-serving bias, and this is interesting. This is the part that's really interesting to me. The self-serving bias is the tendency to attribute our successes to internal stuff, right? So it's an internal factor if it's our success, but if it's a failure, it's external. That's really interesting, right? So the idea here is that we say, yeah, our team really rocked it out because I kept us on track or whatever it is, right? But if something goes bad, then it was, well, the field was messy, or the field was sloppy, or it was raining and we couldn't really do it, or there's something outside of us. And it's really interesting because what's happening is we don't want to associate that failure with us. We want to provide a natural excuse for ourselves. And so that's interesting. Another one is the fundamental attribution error, the tendency to overemphasize internal causes on another person's behavior. So if it's someone else's, the thing is, if it's related to our behavior, we overemphasize the external stuff. But if it's someone else, then we say, oh, it has to be related to you. So we'll give ourselves those excuses, but we won't give anybody else the excuse, right? If you fail, then it's because of you. But if I fail, it's because of external sources. And so I just think that those things are interesting. But go ahead and look through all of those PowerPoints, because I think that this isn't difficult stuff to really kind of understand. But I wanted to hit on some of these things because they influence those internal elements that we're talking about. And then workplace stress, this stuff is pretty straightforward. When we're talking about workplace stress, we're talking about, first of all, what is good stress, what is bad stress, how do we confront and deal with stress, and what is the impact that stress has on our behavior, and how can we manage stress. That's really what that entire chapter is about. So I think that's all you really need to know. However, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Good luck, everybody.